Good evening, lovely listeners. This is the Armed Historian, and I know I've done a whole bunch of theology books lately, and since my name is the Armed Historian, I thought it would be appropriate if I actually did a book that related to history. So today I'm going to do a book review on Against the Tide, the Golev Story. This is a book written about Sergei Golev, a pastor and evangelist in Russia during the time of the Soviet Union. To start out, I would like to read the foreword of the book by way of introduction. Quote, "There are poignant moments in this true story, but it is no catalogue of sufferings. The name of Sergei Golev is little known outside the Soviet Union, largely because he did not vaunt his sufferings. In fact, it was his wish that this book should only appear after his death. Perhaps this book is introducing you to the name Golev for the very first time. But there are many hundreds, even thousands, of his fellow Baptists in the USSR who thank God for his life and what it has meant to them. Sergei Golev was a key figure in the crisis which faced the church and still continues to confront Christians in the Soviet Union, as well as in many other lands today, whether to obey the message of the Bible or to submit to the demands imposed by atheistic rulers. This account conveys graphically the difficulties in which a totalitarian regime places those of its citizens who acknowledge Jesus as Lord." End of quote. Now, the copyright of this book is 1980, so the foreword was referring to the USSR as currently existing. Of course, we know that the USSR fell, and it is now Russia once again. This book is Sergei Golev's account, but was not published until after he died in 1976. Many Christians had urged him to tell his story. He originally refused because he did not want accolades aimed in his direction rather than glory given to God. But after being repeatedly encouraged that his story would benefit Christians in general, he finally told his story, but agreed only if it was published after his death. Sergei Golev was born in 1896 in a small village called Ivankovo. Ivankovo was in the Ryazan district, located about 120 miles southeast of Moscow. His parents were very religious, members of the Russian Orthodox Church. Sergei was a minimalist when it came to religion. He felt that one only needed to do what the priests of the Orthodox Church said he needed to do in order to please God and achieve heaven. A spiritual revival swept Russia at the turn of the century, and in 1908 it reached Ivankovo. Sergei's uncle, Konrady Demyantovich, was one of the earliest converts. Konrady promptly began witnessing to his fellow villagers. Many others found the Lord, and Konrady started a youth group. Sergei, however, was unmoved by his uncle's attempt to witness to him. He considered his uncle to be stupid. Quote, "How stupid of him, I thought. If he wants to get to heaven, he has only to pray to God and keep all the teachings of the Orthodox Church. Why do people everlastingly want to go on making matters more complicated unnecessarily?" Taken from pages 11 and 12. Now, just a little interjection real quick. When I was in college, which feels like many, many years ago at this point, I did take a couple semesters of Russian, but it was super difficult and I didn't retain a ton. But I am going to try my best at pronouncing some of these Russian names. But if you know how to speak Russian and you know I'm butchering them, please don't judge me too harshly. Anyway, let's continue. When an evangelist came to his town in 1910, Sergei decided to attend the meetings since there was little else to do in their town. He went to the meetings for entertainment purposes only. He was chatting with his guy friends. He was checking out the pretty girls. But what was in his mind as entertainment only turned out to be the turning point of his entire life. God found him and regenerated his heart at those evangelist meetings. His initial enthusiasm as a new convert was quickly doused by the mocking questions of friends who made fun of his newfound faith. However, as he studied the scriptures, his confidence grew and his witness became bold again. In 1914, he was conscripted into the army. Incidentally, he sums up his entire army experience in one single sentence that goes something like this. He was conscripted, he served 10 years, and he returned home. That's all he says. So I thought we could take a quick look at history and see what all actually happened during those 10 years. These were 10 of the most volatile years in Russian history. So let's recap that. In 1914, World War I started. Of course, we know this was ignited by the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, who was visiting Serbia. The Serbians were Slavs, as were the Russians. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, the Russian troops mobilized to come to their defense. At this time, Nicholas II was Tsar of Russia. He was a relatively weak ruler, politically speaking, but he also ruled with a heavy hand, if that makes sense. That may seem contradictory, but there it is. The people were also angry with him because he was easily manipulated by his wife, Alexandra. And Alexandra was under the influence of this guy named Rasputin, who is described as a crazy religious man from the Orthodox Church. And if you ever want to study up on him, he's nuts. That's a whole nother study in and of itself. But revolutionary activity, which already existed in Russia, just increased exponentially during Nicholas's rule, as people were discontent with his rule. On March 5th of 1917, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. A provisional government led by Kerensky was set up. Russia at this point is still participating in World War I. On November 7 of 1917, so the same year, the Bolsheviks seized power, led by Vladimir Lenin. They overthrew the provisional government, and Lenin knew that he could not fight a war in Europe and at the same time consolidate control in Russia, so he quickly made peace with Germany and withdrew Russia from World War I. And then started a 4-year bloody civil war in Russia. Lenin ultimately secured control. He became the dictator of Russia, and he died in 1924. So there you go, 1914 to 1924, the 10 years that Sergei Golev served in the army. So one can only imagine what all he saw and what all he did and what all he endured. He returned home in 1924 and married a young woman in his church named Daria Vasilyevna. He began to pursue life as an evangelist. He said they had relative freedom of religion at that time. They had the right to assemble and the right to go on missionary journeys as long as the journeys were pre-approved by the government. However, when an evangelist came to town predicting the end of their religious freedoms, no one believed him. But 3 years later, that evangelist was sentenced to years in a prison camp for preaching the gospel. Golev states that news began to trickle into their town over the next several years of other Christians being imprisoned from 10 to 25 years for the gospel in hard labor prisons. For historical reference, Joseph Stalin managed to secure power by the end of the 1920s, and his policies really began to crack down on Christians. By 1937, Golev and Daria had 5 children together, ranging from 1 to 13 years old. Golev was arrested for his faith that year. He was sent to a hard labor camp in Karelia near the Finnish border. For the entire first year of his term, he did not speak to anyone about his faith. He was frozen with fear, having heard that others had had their sentences extended for preaching the gospel in prison. But after being falsely accused of damaging property and being forced to spend a night in an isolation cell, it was 5 degrees below zero, and there were gaps in the wall large enough to stick his arm. He nearly froze to death that night. He realized his life wasn't any safer for not having shared his faith, and he began to share his faith with others in the prison. He also shares with his readers how a precious Bible was smuggled into the prison by his sister, and it became one of their prized possessions. On November 14, 1947, his term was completed and he was sent home. As he re-entered society, he came face to face with government-appointed senior pastors. Churches, in order to be legal, were required to register with the government. The government would then appoint a senior pastor to be over the local pastor of that church. The Golev family now lived in Pskov, and their local church pastor, Diamanty Vasilyev, was frustrated with their appointed senior pastor, Mikhail Sazontovich Kapustinsky. I stumble over that word every time. Kapustinsky. There we go. Rather than preach and further the gospel, Kapustinsky seemed to be trying to thwart the gospel in their church, and he was also embezzling church funds. Golev suggested inviting Kapustinsky to a meeting with the entire congregation in order to discuss the concerns of the congregants. Kapustinsky reluctantly agreed to the meeting. Of course, he denied all of the allegations leveled against him. Ultimately, Golev was reported to the government by Kapustinsky. Golev recounts the betrayal, much like Judas Iscariot's betrayal, with a kiss. Quote, Sergei Golev, I hope you do not feel hurt at my not giving you a chance to speak. No, I said, I'm quite happy to let others do the talking. Forgive me, my brother, he said, and kissed me. 4 days later, I was arrested and found myself once more in prison, this time in Pskov. I was accused of having preached the gospel and of being a member of a counter-revolutionary sect. I was given a life sentence and sent to the province of Krasnoyarsk, taken from page 26. Now, while Golev does state that he was sent to prison for this term, he also states that his wife and children chose to join him. They built a house and they lived together. He also recounts the difficulty he had in walking 20 kilometers one way back and forth to the closest church. So I believe that this was more a case of exile in a remote part of Siberia rather than an actual labor camp. He says they were 280 kilometers from the closest train station and that winter temperatures would fall over 55 degrees below freezing. This was his life sentence. But when the dictator Joseph Stalin died on March 5th of 1953, a general amnesty was declared and Golev and his family were allowed to return home to Ryazan. Golev began traveling around, catching up with old friends and family members. He had occasion to meet with a man named Ilya Grigorievich Ivanov in Moscow, who in turn invited him to work for the All-Union Council of the Evangelical Christian Baptists. Golev was initially thrilled and accepted the position on the condition that he be given 2 months before starting to continue his travels to friends and family. However, during those 2 months, he encountered many churches that were being hindered by their government-appointed senior pastors. One such senior pastor told Golev that he had no choice but to report back to the government, as if his hands were tied from doing right. Another senior pastor would preach from the newspaper instead of the Bible. Another was routinely drunk from the pulpit. Churches were frustrated. Many felt their hands were tied. Many local pastors felt there was nothing they could do other than flow along with their appointed senior pastor. Golev took these findings back to Moscow when he returned to Ivanov. He explained what he saw happening in the churches that he had traveled to. Ivanov stated, quote, We know all about what you have told me, and a great deal more you have not mentioned. But tell me, what are we to do? End of quote. Golev told him that he could not work for the All Council of the Evangelical Christian Baptists and play a role in this treachery at work in the churches. When Golev returned to Ryazan, he began working a great deal more with unregistered churches. Remember that a church, in order to meet legally, had to register with the government. Unregistered churches did not feel that they could function in good conscience under the thumb of government control. Tensions escalated in 1960 when the All-Union Council issued new statutes and letters of instruction that all registered churches had to abide by. These new statutes consisted of 3 policies that the registered churches had to conform to. Number 1, children were not allowed to attend public worship. Number 2, no one under 18 is to be baptized, and for preference, none between the ages of 18 and 30 either. Number 3, no missionary work may be undertaken. Taken from page 40. Golev goes into great deal, sharing some of the struggles that the Ryazan Registered Church and other churches like them went through during this time. Many were divided. By rejecting the new statutes, they would lose their registered status. Some felt they should just accept the new statutes in order to maintain the status quo. They felt there was no other alternative. Others, like Golev, rightly saw these new statutes as an affront to God and a sin to accept. Churches were split over the issues. Ultimately, the Ryazan church decided to reject the new statutes when the council chairman of the church, Bykov, met with the local government representative from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Bykov had originally been willing to be compliant with the government. However, when this representative stated, quote, We are moving towards total communism. To complete our task, Christianity must be got out of the way. End of quote. Bykov realized the true mission of the new statutes. Not all churches saw this, however, and many were in fact compliant. A new organization started called the Initiative Group, or I'm going to butcher this word, folks. I don't know how to say this. The Itzia Devinki, made up of Baptist reformers who refused to comply with the government regulations. Golev was invited to join the Initiative Group and accepted. Golev's work with the Initiative Group led to his arrest once again, this time for 18 months in a prison. This was in 1966, so Golev would have been around 70 years old. His health plagued him during those months, and there were times he felt close to death's door. But God saw him through this term and back to freedom. Golev died in his own home on January 30, 1976, at nearly 80 years old. He concluded his story with the following statement. Quote, many people will wonder how anyone who has spent so many years in a labor camp or a prison can yet be so happy. My answer would be that those were the happiest years of my life, because the greater my need, the nearer God was to me. He surrounded me with his eternal love, strengthened me in all adversity, and assured me that I am his and he is mine. Taken from page 59. This was a short book and an easy read and inspiring to boot. When I think of how easy we Christians have it here in the United States, I wonder how many of us would be willing to risk our comfort in order to stand up for the gospel. I personally found the book very convicting. While I love to read about his life, I also found myself reflecting on if I would have been as strong as he was in the same shoes. So I would encourage you to find a copy and read it for yourselves. I'm not sure if it is still being printed. The copyright is dated 1980 by the Underground Evangelism Organization and printed by Hunt Barnard Printing Ltd. in Great Britain. I have another book that I cross-referenced quite a bit for this book review called Religious Ferment in Russia, Protestant Opposition to Soviet Religious Policy by Michael Bordeaux, copyright 1968, that provided some additional insight into the All-Union Council of Evangelical Christian Baptists, as well as the Initiative Group or the Baptist Reformers. I didn't necessarily read that book. It might be a book that I'll read down the road at a later time, but it was super helpful to cross-reference for some information about some of the things Golev talked about. So check that out too if you wish. All right, that's all I have for you tonight. I hope you have a fun summer. Stay cool, stay safe, and stay armed with God's Word. Good night.